What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another video, and today we're going to be continuing the competitive player series that I have been doing and kind of on and off here over the last few months. And the point of the series is to kind of find different aspects of competitive Magic and try to help you improve in those areas so you can start winning more and more matches. Of course, before we get too deep into today's topic, if you're not subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos like this and other Modern and Pioneer content videos, be sure to subscribe, ring the notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. And if you go down to the description down below, there's a link to my Discord server. Feel free to go over there and join as well. And today, while it is not a sexy topic by any measure, it is something that I think is very important because I think it's something that a lot of players end up doing wrong and need to at least have a little bit more of a disciplined kind of approach to it. So today we're going to be taking a look at like mulliganing, like the kind of like the theory behind it, what you kind of want to look for, and some expectations that you should have for various hands in different situations. So of course, let's just get right into it. Mulliganing is, I think, very hard. As I said earlier, it's probably one of the things that gets a lot of players in troubles and puts you in bad positions like right off the rip. Obviously, for like mulliganing decisions in like game one, you're essentially looking for just functional hands depending on what kind of archetype you're playing. I break them down into four basic types. You have like aggro, control, then you have like combo and mid range, and definitely depending on like kind of just like a gut feeling. Like if you have no idea what your opponent's playing, you're just looking for a hand that functions, right? So if you're playing like an aggro deck, you ideally want like 2 to 3 lands and then like 5 to 4 spells that all kind of like curve out. Obviously, if you have like 2 lands and a bunch of 4 drops in hand, like we know that's a mulligan. We know that if your curve in your hand goes like 1, 2, 3, 4, and you have 3 lands, chances are you're probably going to draw a fourth land, up by the time you get to like turn 4, so you're going to able to curve out and use all your mana effectively. We all know that those hands are either really good and we are just like snapping off a keep, or we know that for a fact that we're just throwing it back and we're hoping to draw a better 7 card hand or I guess a better 6 card hand, but you're always going to draw 7 cards anyway. It's the in between that I think gets a lot of players in trouble, and it's when things are not so clear and you kind of just have to make a decision that could really go one way or the other. So, a lot of times, like if you find yourself bargaining a lot, or if you're like, if I draw this, this, and this, then this hand is just going to be amazing. Well, yeah, but you could also just draw a new hand and potentially just have more of those things, even going down one less card. And even with the latest mulligan rule, at least as of the recording of this video, if it ever decides to change, the London Mulligan allows you to draw 7 cards every time that you mulligan, and then you put a number of cards back equal to the number of times that you have mulliganed, until you actually decide to keep. So if you mulligan twice, you'll draw 7 cards, each time, but then on, the second time you mulligan, you draw 7, you decide to keep, you put 2 cards on the bottom. No big deal. While a lot of times it seems like it's a very polarizing to like combo decks and kind of incentivizes like combo players, really it incentivizes you as like a combo player. Like if you're going to mulligan that low, you're looking for very specific pieces and essentially just hoping that your opponent doesn't interact, because you are still going down not like just resources, raw resources in general. And with the state of Magic currently, where at least in the Modern and Pioneer format, where Rakdos is one of the best decks to be playing in the format, and Thoughtseizes are running around in Pioneer, and then Thoughtseize and Grief are in Modern as well, you do get punished if you try to play super aggressively mulliganing, where you are just looking for a hand that functions better, or looking for like a nut draw. So obviously, we have to get better at evaluating hands that you can keep that are pretty close to our range of that we're snapping this off, and farther away from this is a mulligan, whatnot. So kind of a few ideas as of like what archetype that you are looking to kind of mulligan with, just in general how you're playing, and then we're going to look at some examples of some other decks that kind of pertain to those archetypes and what exactly that we're looking for, and kind of why we would decide to mulligan or not with those hands. So in general, like with aggro strategies, I tend to obviously prioritize being able to do things in the early game. Maybe if it's not perfectly 1, 2, 3, maybe it's like 1, 2, and then 4, 5 or something like that, and you have like 3 lands in hand. You can reasonably like come up with an argument where like that hand is probably on the borderline of like keepable. I would say if you feel comfortable with like your aggro plan, and obviously you know how your deck is constructed, where you know that like, hey, I'm very likely to draw at least one more land, and then I can play some of the other 3 drops and stuff in my deck. You know, you can definitely end up leaning towards keeping like that sort of hand. You get to do things in like the early game, and that's kind of like the important thing of like aggro strategies, is just to kind of apply that pressure early on and force your opponent to have answers, and really just start asking them really tough questions about how they're going to deal with your board in the early turns, and maybe forces them to like play off a little bit, and you end up getting to kind of circumvent the fact that you didn't go 1-2-3. Maybe you went 1-2 and then 2-1, or 1-2-1-1. You know, however the case may be, you just want to make sure that you have a pretty aggressive game plan early on with like a lot of hands, and you really don't want to keep hands that are slow unless you decide that you want to take the kind of controlling route, which is like another topic that we'll tackle, you know, in a later video. As far as like control players, where I think is like an aggro deck, you want like lands that or hands that have like 2 to 3 lands in hand, and you know, going to 4 and 5 is kind of pushing it. I think control decks, and by extension like mid-range decks, are kind of the opposite. I feel like a lot of mid-range decks kind of play like this controlling game in game ones, just in the dark, because most of the time like people aren't playing necessarily control strategies, they're kind of playing like these combo and aggro strategies, especially like in Pioneer. And I think you want to be like more towards like interactive and just being sure that you can actually like double spell in certain spots. So for like control and mid-range decks, if your hands are like 3, 4, even 5 lands, like those 5 land hands, like if you have just like 2 really powerful spells that are going to really impact the board and impact your opponent's game plan, just in a general sense, then I definitely think they're worth keeping. 5 is definitely getting towards like that borderline of like, this might not be good enough, but definitely like 4 lands, 3 spells from like a control deck and for a mid-range deck are going to be very good, because you're going to hit your land drops for the first 4 turns. You're going to be very likely to be able to double spell and kind of keep up with your opponent, and hopefully run them out of resources, and where you know you can use like draw spells, or even, you know, in the case of like mid-range decks, playing some of your very powerful creatures and forcing your opponent to answer those after you have dealt with their threats. And of course, like as a combo deck, we all know that like you know, if you play like Yawgmoth, if you play like Storm or something like that, you know that what you're looking for. You need a critical mass of cards. You need to assemble 2, 3, 4 pieces, and getting to do that in a 7 card hand is pretty hard. But when you get to look at 7 cards, you know, 2, 3 times is a lot easier to find those pieces. And in generally for like game ones myself, if I'm just missing like a single piece, but I have everything else, and I am able to interact a little bit like what my opponent has going on, then I am more than comfortable with keeping it. Especially like with Yawgmoth, you kind of really don't have a choice. Like if your hand is just missing Yawgmoth, you know, you have, you know, 4 copies of it. You have 4 Quarter Calling. You have like 1 or 2 Eldritch Evolution. You have many different ways that you can go find it, and of course, you know, some of the other like utility lands like Takanuma to get them back. You know, those are some things you have to keep in mind. You know, when you go past just like the broad sense of I'm playing this archetype, this is how I should play. But I think these are still like good starting points, and these are things that you can kind of take, and then you can figure out yourself and figure out your own decisions of like when you want to mulligan, and hands that are on that borderline, hands that you absolutely should keep 100% of the time, and other hands that you should just throw back and try to get a better 6 card hand than what you have at 7. And that could even be like kind of the benchmark as well, where if you have a 7 card hand and you're like, hey, if I mulligan to 6, like how much better does this hand get? If it doesn't get much better, I usually lean towards keeping it. Again, just in a blind sense, like I have no idea what my opponent is doing. You know, if my hand is pretty good, or if I evaluate it and I have like a game plan and I kind of know what's going to go on and I know how I want the game to play out, then I will keep it and do my best as like a player to kind of enact those skills and get the game to where I want it to go, so that my hand is ends up being pretty good rather than being pretty lackluster. Of course, you know, there's times that you're going to, you know, be like a control deck and you're going to keep like these 1 or 2 lane hands, and things aren't going to work out that well. And those are some things that we just need to try and avoid. But with that said, that's kind of like my theory, my kind of baseline of evaluating mulligans and stuff. Let's go ahead. We're going to take a look at a few examples and kind of wrap this thing up, hopefully very nicely, and helps you get a better understanding of how we want to mulligan and how we make mulligan decisions going forward. So here we have Rakdos midrange. This is the number one most played deck in Pioneer currently, and for good reason. There's a lot of very powerful, plays and stuff that this deck has that, is just very hard for a lot of opponents just to beat, blindly in game one, and then just from how grindy the deck is, it can try to scratch out a win in like game two or game three, even if the opponent is maybe relatively favored in like the matchup. Of course, it being a mid-range deck, usually that advantage towards either side isn't really that high, but definitely a deck where if you can mulligan well and can kind of read the matchups very well, that you can go pretty far with this deck. So the sample hand that we got here, we have a Blood Crypt, a Mountain, and an Urborg as our lands, and then we have a Fatal Push, a Kroxa, a Heartless Act, and a Fable, the Mirror Breaker. This hand almost feels like a little bit of a trap. And, the main reason being, we do have a fatal push. We have some interaction on turn one. We have something to do on turn two, whether it's having another removal spell or just playing a Kroxa to kind of ding our opponent's hand. And then we can curve into a Fable, the Mirror Breaker. Obviously, the strength, I think, of this mid-range deck in particular, I think we would want like a fatal push or a Thoughtseize instead of a fatal push here, just to kind of see what our opponent's doing, and it would kind of dictate better what our two drop's going to do rather than us having just a fatal push on like turn one. Obviously, we want to kind of like play our Blood Crypt first, and I guess we technically could just play it tapped and not play the Fatal Push, but then again, like we could also play Urborg and kind of like be left in like the same position. So really overall, I think this hand is pretty close. I think the fact that you have kind of like that option on turn two and going into like Fable on turn three, and Fable is just so powerful and could really fix a lot of what goes on here. Like even if this Fatal Push and this Heartless Act are essentially dead, we find out like, hey, we can just play Crocs on turn two, and Amazon will not leave me alone. We can play Crocs on like turn two, and then turn three Fable, and that's going to help fuel the Crocs and stuff. So I think I've actually convinced myself that this hand is a keep, and it ends up getting paid off really well if you're playing against like an aggro opponent, or even if you're playing like kind of the mirror and they play their Bloodscythe Harvester on two. You have Fatal Push, get rid of it, and then you can untap, play like a Croxa, ding something out of their hand, and then Fable can kind of like help take over the game if they're not able to answer, even especially answer the token, but then also answer the Fable itself before it flips. Overall, I think this is like a pretty good hand, and kind of the idea of like what you're looking for. These mid-range decks, you have three lands, you have a way to potentially hit your fourth and maybe even fifth land drop, and of course, knowing what we know about the deck, we can draw into like Thoughtseizes and kind of disrupt our opponent a little bit. Kroxa looks like it's going to be like going towards like our end game, again, just by being able to cast some of these other spells and then play, then discard cards off of Fable the Mirror Breaker. Of course, we also have the choice to discard cards. We do not have the choice for Amazon to leave us alone. But that said, this hand ends up being pretty good, I would say, in my opinion, and at least has what we're looking for in game ones, where it has a clear game plan of what we want to do from the opening, and then, we can kind of branch out from there. Obviously, mid-range decks are a little bit more flexible in the fact that you can kind of go from being a control strategy to an aggressive strategy, and Croxa will end the game like super, super quickly. So, that's kind of like what we're looking at from like these mid-range decks. It's super simple, clear cut and dry. We have a clear game plan. We know how to attack game one, and then we can further evaluate in the game as we figure out what our opponent is doing. So let's go ahead, look over at another Pioneer deck, and then after we look at that deck, we're going to be moving over to Modern. So let's go ahead and take a look at our next deck. So here we have a hand from Mono White Aggro. This is essentially, I think, the better of the two aggro decks, I think, in Pioneer currently. Even though, like, I would consider Boros Convoke to be an aggro deck, but I think it mulligans pretty much like a combo deck in ways. I mean, I think if you understand how to mulligan with an aggro deck, you know how to mulligan, later on with the convoke deck after you try to find like the nut draw where you put like 14 power into play on turn 2. But with a hand like this, we're looking at 3 planes. We're looking at a Hopeful Initiate and a Ward in the Undersky as our 1 mana spells, and then Coppercoat Vanguard times 2 for our 2 drops. This hand actually would be pretty interesting for the fact that you could play like this Initiate on 1, you play this Coppercoat on 2. It's going to make your opponent's removal spells a little bit worse. And if you can get this other Coppercoat Vanguard down, they're going to be able to help each other out with Ward 1, while also essentially making your opponents pay 2 mana for some of these other spells. And you can kind of get some card, at least some card selection with Ward in the Inner Sky to kind of like tap these things and end up drawing some extra, or not even really drawing cards, but getting to put counters on it and then scrying, and then eventually getting it big enough to where it's going to be able to attack and put pressure on your opponent relatively quickly. I think this hand is pretty close just because how we were talking in the beginning, where you had hands that maybe go like 1 mana spell, 2 mana spell, and then 2 mana spell, 1 mana spell. This definitely fits like that curve. This is something that we can do easily in game 1. Your opponent's going to be prioritizing getting rid of like a Coppercoat Vanguard, so being able to kind of follow it up with a Vanguard plus another 1-drop, being able to kind of keep the pressure going with your 1 mana spell, to keep getting in and attacking, and of course we're just hoping to not like flood out. We have draw another 1-drop, draw an Ossification, draw like another card, and we have like a Mutavault, and this is like another like human essentially to get buffed by Coppercoat Vanguard. Doesn't really work out, I think, super well, because you definitely, at least in this specific case, you want to draw like Adeline to play on like turn 3 and follow it up with like the Coppercoat Vanguard, what have you. So then you can start making other humans, and Coppercoat Vanguard can protect them and whatever. But by and large, like a hand like this, I wouldn't fault anyone for keeping, just for again like having this kind of aggressive opening that you go 1 mana spell into 2 mana spell into 1 mana spell, 2 mana spell, and especially if like both Coppercoat Vanguards live, like there's just so much upside there in just protecting these spells, and even making it very hard for Rakdos to be able to interact with like these creatures. Like sure, like they're like Rakdos' creatures are going to be a little bit bigger, but you have this Warden of the Sky, of the Inner Sky, to like, it's protected through multiple layers of Coppercoat Vanguard ward triggers. And of course, like Ape King, I have Flying and Vigilance. If it has 3 more counters on it, you're just able to attack, get in tons of damage, and then like post combat, like scry and try to get rid of maybe some of these other cards and find some more aggressive pieces to it. That's going to wrap up kind of our mulligan decisions. I think more mid-range decks and like aggro decks and things like that exist in Pioneer more so than in Modern. So we're going to take a look at Modern and kind of look at like the other side of the spectrum with a notable, like maybe not something you would think of as like a combo deck, but a deck that mulligans extremely, kind of how a combo deck wants to mulligan. So let's go ahead and take a look at Modern and look at our first deck. I will say I got extremely lucky with this Tron hand, which is basically how Tron goes. So in something like Tron, and kind of in a way that you think of like combo decks and how you want to mulligan, is again having like a clear game plan of how you're going to do the thing you want to do and what you need to actually get there. So of course the point of Tron is having Urza's Mine, Urza's Tower, Urza's Power Plant all in play, and then with all of them together they make 7 mana instead of making 1 colorless mana individually. So with a hand like this, I mean, it's super clear cut. You have Tron land number 1 plus a Chromatic Sphere to eventually give you green mana. So then on the next turn, you can play the second named Tron piece, and you can go get the third one, which is a tower with Sylvan Scrying. You have Walking Ballista to kind of dump your mana into. You have Relic to kind of, play it, cycle it through. So you have a little bit of graveyard hate against some of the other decks. And then you have like this top end of Ulamog, where if you just draw another tower on turn 4, you end up playing an Ulamog, and the game is virtually over at that point. Of course, like there's some outs that your opponents have to like an Ulamog, But really, like if your opponent even stumbles a little bit and you're able to turn forward Lamog them, like this hand has a lot of upside. Of course, if they're playing like even like Yawgmoth or like any of these other creature decks, you have like a Walking Ballista to not only sink mana into later, you get up to like a 3/3, and then you're able to put 1 to 2 counters on it a turn. And eventually, it just gets so big you attack with it, and you kind of get force your opponent in some pretty bad positions. You can even eventually just end the game by shooting them with all the counters on like the Walking Ballista, and this is kind of the idea and what we were talking about with like these combo hands, where you basically either want like all your pieces or all the ways to find all your pieces, or maybe end up like one piece short with a high likelihood of being able to find like that last piece. You definitely don't want to, like, if the Sylvan Scrying isn't here, or like if you don't have like a Chromatic Sphere and it's like a forest, like you get rid of the Sylvan Scrying, you get rid of the sphere, and like you have like 2 other lands that aren't tower. This hand is surely a mulligan. If we're looking at like 4 lands in this hand and none of them equal power plant, mine, and tower, this hand just is pretty bad. And even like having like not having the Sylvan Scrying, maybe having like another Chromatic Sphere wouldn't be really good enough. Ancient Stirrings, while it isn't a guarantee, is another card that you could have in place of Sylvan Scrying, where you could end up keeping a hand like this and eventually end up getting paid off, just because again you're going to be looking at so many cards that you're able to kind of be likely to hit it. Now, if we look at like a new hand, like this even though it finds all the pieces of Tron, it's not really doing anything. And like the best case scenario would be like if Star ended up finding like Power Plant or Tower, which is the one piece that we're missing, and then Sylvan or Ancient Stirrings rather could go and find a threat. But as a hand like this, even though it does kind of fit our criteria of finding, initiating our game plan and what we want to do, we just have no payoffs in a hand like this. If maybe this is like our 5-card hand, this would end up being capable, because at that point you kind of have to temper some expectations. You can put like down like a forest and a blast zone, and being left with like forest, mine, Sylvan Scrying, Ancient Stirrings really isn't that bad, especially when you can lead on mine to play like the Chromatic Star, and then you can at least like add like a few draw steps, find another Tron piece, and even use the Ancient Stirrings to find it. So like as a 5-card hand, this would be pretty good. As a 7-card hand, I would definitely look towards like mulliganing this and finding something a little bit better. And you have something like this that just looks like a complete and giant mess. So mulliganing with these combo decks and decks that have like this combo philosophy can be really difficult. I mean, I think really easy when you have like 7-card hands, but then you evaluate those. Like on your second mulligan, you evaluate those 7-card hands on if you have like 5 cards, and you just kind of have to take what you can get at that point, and just kind of hope that your opponent can't disrupt your game plan too much. Because again, being down resources, and then not only that, but being thrown off of kind of your game plan makes it very difficult going forward. So finally, we'll take a look at like another kind of like Cornication-ish kind of like control deck that ends up kind of like breaking that mold of mulliganing and kind of like forces you to kind of think about some of those decisions. So let's go ahead and take a look at our last deck. So here we have a blue-red Murktide for Modern, and it kind of breaks the mold, because I think of like tempo decks in kind of the same vein as mid-range decks, but I think mid-range decks kind of look to play like a longer, more controlling matchup, and the tempo decks tend to want to be aggressive early on and then kind of like protect their position, where the mid-range decks kind of force, I guess, rather like let you kind of like play out your game plan. They try to be more reactive to you, and then they try to close the door with a big threat, kind of like how control decks end up doing it. But obviously also having the switch to like be aggressive, and I think tempo decks play a little bit worse as control decks but better as aggro decks, where mid-range decks tend to be worse aggro decks but better control decks. So you just kind of get like both ends of the spectrum there. And like a hand like this, where you're looking at double Dragon Rage Channeler and Iteration, Bauble, Murktide Regent, and 2 lands, there's an argument to be made that if you had just like say the Spirebluff Canal, and then like the Scalding Tarn was like another spell, you could end up keeping a hand like this. And while generally, as I'd been saying, like as kind of like these strategies where like you're playing aggressive, like 1-land hands in particular, because Modern is a weird and funky format and Mishra's Bauble is still legal, you can keep hands like this because of like Dragon Rage Channeler's ability to surveil, kind of put cards in the graveyard. It ends up feeling like this Murktide Regent that we have in our hand as well. And of course, on top of that too, we're going to be able to find like a second land, again, pretending like we don't have the Scalding Tarn. We're going to be able to play a Dragon Rage Channeler, surveil with a Mishra's Bauble, more than likely end up drawing another 1-mana spell or another land, so then we can play this Expressive Iteration, trigger Dragon Rage Channeler again, get more card types into the graveyard to hopefully get a Delirious and start attacking. Or in the worst case, if like we find another Mishra's Bauble, we end up playing a Dragon Rage Channeler and getting to like miss our land drop, but then again be super likely to end up hitting a second land after Dragon Rage Channeler triggers, plus up a draw from Mishra's Bauble, plus a draw step. So definitely a deck that in kind of breaks. I think that a lot of these decks end up like breaking the mold of like that general idea where it doesn't follow exactly how you want to evaluate them, because again, like there's new information being added about like deck construction, the format that you're playing, and where you're playing. But by and large, I think the tools and stuff that we went over at the beginning of the video, and kind of like how you want to evaluate these hands with the more information that you have, will end up making your mulligan decisions miles better than what they could have been. And of course, like you can come up with like your own theories and hands that you're willing to keep, and why that you would keep them. Kind of as you play a deck more, as you get comfortable with the deck, the lines start to become a little bit clearer of like what's capable and what's not. But usually the kind of linchpin, I think, in a way of kind of stopping you from playing very well and kind of getting to the next level, is when you kind of like switch to a new deck and you're kind of like have an idea of like what you're looking for, but then you don't get what you're looking for. How well can you be disciplined to mulligan hands that are bad and keep hands that are not really like amazing, but end up actually being pretty good and end up making them play great just through being able to use each individual card to its most effective. And at the end of the day, mulliganing is just one part of the game, and this is just like the pregame things that you can do to increase your win rate and give yourself a lot better of a chance to win games that maybe traditionally in the past you would have not have been very likely to win. Of course, that's going to do it for this video. I hope y'all enjoyed this lesson in mulliganing and kind of figuring out how to evaluate certain hands and kind of like what you should be looking for. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like on the video. Of course, consider subscribing, ring the notification bell so you know when other videos get posted. I'm hoping tomorrow to have some kind of game plan, which of course some gameplay rather, and I'm sure that I'm going to end up keeping some bad hands over there, so you might as well check that out and then call me out for it after I just put out literally a lesson about like mulliganing and stuff. Of course, join the Discord server. The link is in the description down below. Subscribe to the channel, all that. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next video.